Hey everybody! Today is going to be the first in a series of 8 videos I'm doing exploring a specific exhibit at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History called The Price of Freedom: Americans at War. I have visited this exhibit many times now and I really enjoy it. The exhibit itself is over 18,000 square feet with over 800 artifacts, so it is way too large to put it all in one video. It covers American military history chronologically from the mid-18th century French and Indian War all the way up through the Vietnam War and present-day conflicts. There are 8 major wars and military conflicts presented in this exhibit, and I'd like to take them one by one and show you all the artifacts, read to you what is on the displays about the exhibits, and learn together how war has shaped the geography, social values, and world roles of this country. The exhibit provides both a sweeping historical scope and deeply personal stories, exploring not only how wars were fought, but also why they mattered, how they impacted the world in their aftermath, and how they continue to affect our world today. If you're interested in military history, I hope you will enjoy these videos and come along for the adventure with me. The very first part of this exhibit will take us back to the mid-1700s, long before the United States existed as a nation. The French and Indian War, fought from 1754 until 1763, was the North American theater of a global struggle between Britain and France. Here, British colonial forces, often made up of American colonists, joined British regular troops to fight against French forces and their Native American allies over control over land and trade routes across the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes. The war reshaped the map of North America, ending French colonial ambitions and vastly expanding British territory. But victory came at a cost. The war left Britain deeply in debt and led to new taxations and policies that angered colonists, tensions that would soon erupt into the American Revolution. This first section of the exhibit is important because it helps set the stage for everything else that followed. Here is a summary of the French and Indian War in a nutshell. In 1754, the global rivalry between Britain and France led to war in America. Britain went to war to prevent French expansion into British-claimed territory in the Ohio River Valley. Provincial troops and citizen militias in the colonies took up arms. British soldiers were dispatched to America. Indians joined the fighting on both sides. War soon broke out in Europe as well and raged on for 7 years. Ultimately, Britain won, adding Canada, Florida, and the Great Lakes region to its tribal holdings. France lost nearly all of its North American empire. British colonies raised provincial regiments and called out citizen militias to advance their interests, often against neighboring Indians. These local forces also saved Britain the trouble of dispatching large numbers of its own troops to the colonies. Provincial units were comprised of long-term regional volunteers equipped by each colony. Militias were comprised of local white men, sometimes free black men, between the ages of 16 and 60 who trained irregularly and who were mustered or called out only as needed. They provided their own weapons. Citizen soldiers were highly valued by the colonists. Here we have a .75 caliber matchlock musket made in Massachusetts about 1650, a .75 caliber Brown Bess musket from 1746 carried by the British troops, a .65 caliber American long rifle from about 1760, a powder horn inscribed Robert Holmes Fort Edward 1758, and also there is a plug bayonet. Bayonets began as gun tools, note the screwdriver and tapping hammer on the crosspiece. But when inserted into the barrel, they transformed a musket into a thrusting weapon. Various Indian groups joined the battle, mostly on the side of the French, but many for the British. Others remained neutral. American Indians had complex interrelationships with European powers. The Iroquois were staunch British allies. Their rivals, the Huron and Algonquin, allied themselves with the French. Indians saw alliances as a way to play the Europeans against each other and against rival Indians in order to protect their own interests and autonomy. This is a Mohican Indian in the Stockbridge, New York militia. The background mural is called Indians in the Battle of Lake George from 1755. Wars frequently erupted in North America in the 1600s and 1700s as rival empires clashed with each other and with resident Indians. Spain, France, and Britain established colonies around the world to enrich their economies, enhance their prestige, and increase their power. All three countries laid claim to portions of North America already settled by Indians. They waged war with Indian nations to establish footholds in America, and they fought with each other to advance colonial interests or to gain the upper hand in European-centered power struggles. This map of North America is from 1763. In 1754, the French occupied eastern Canada and watersheds from the Great Lakes to the mouth of the Mississippi River. They sought to tap the riches of the North American fur trade and to contain British expansion. British settlements in 1754 were scattered along the Atlantic seaboard. They were tied to the mother country by trade, and they patterned their social, political, and economic structures on British models. The Spanish were the first to colonize North America in the 1500s, and by 1754, they had established settlements in the Caribbean, in Mexico, and from Florida all the way to California. Hundreds of thousands of Indians occupied North America. Their relationships with each other and with Europeans were based variously on trade, alliance, rivalry, and warfare. The British military had little respect for colonial provincial troops or local militia who had fought the opening battles of the war against the French and their Indian allies. Colonials continued to fight when regular British soldiers under the command of General Edward Braddock were dispatched from England to conduct the war. After initial setbacks, including a British rout in which Braddock was killed, combined British forces successfully ousted the French from the Ohio River Valley in 1758. Throughout the war, the British disparaged colonial forces. Braddock's aide labeled them as languid, spiritless, and unsoldier-like in appearance. Here we have an English sword, an Iroquois war club, a powder horn depicting French and British troops, a French halbert or pole arm carried by sergeants as a symbol of rank, and a .69 caliber flintlock musket marked Town of Boston and used by militia. The waistcoat was worn by Lieutenant Colonel Adam Stephen of the Virginia Regiment. He wore the gorget with British coat of arms around his neck as a symbol of rank. The British troops that were under the command of Major General Edward Braddock had been dispatched to Virginia in 1755. George Washington accompanied them on their first foray against the French and Indians, which ended in a calamitous defeat near Pittsburgh. Braddock was killed, but Washington emerged from that fray acclaimed. This .71 caliber English flintlock pistol was given to Washington by Braddock. The depiction of Braddock's battle by Edwin Deming is from 1903. Britain imposed taxes on the colonists to defray the ever-increasing expense of securing its empire. Following the victory in the French and Indian War, Britain looked anew at its imperial responsibilities. Parliament decided to secure its expanded American empire with British troops. English commoners paid taxes to support Britain's powerful army and navy and finance its war debt. It seemed fair that the colonists should pay too. When Parliament started taxing colonial trade, many colonists objected. they argued that the taxes were unjust because they were enacted by a parliament where the colonists had no representation and enforced by royal courts which had no local juries. Parliament enacted taxes on newspapers, sugar, and tea. Here we have a Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser, which suspended its publication after this issue to protest the Stamp Act. Also here is a reproduction sugar cone with sugar snips and Chinese imported tea service from approximately 1751 to 1783. In this 1774 British cartoon, Prime Minister Lord North wields a teapot and forces a figure representing America to swallow a bitter draught, which is the laws and taxes that Parliament imposed on the colonies. The king and his government reversed a long-standing, hands-off approach to administering the colonies in America. For years, the colonies had flourished in a state of salutary neglect. Britain had been content to leave the day-to-day administration of local government to its royal governors and the colonies' own English-style representative legislatures, common law jury courts, and local militias. Colonists bristled when the British government began to enact and execute taxes and other binding laws without deference to colonial governments or popular consent. Across the colonies, puppet shows were a source of popular entertainment and political satire. This scene shows how a puppet theater might present Sarah Fulton, the wife of a Boston tea merchant, and Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, in a confrontation over the tax on tea. From Boston to Charleston, about 40% of the colonists protested British policies. As Parliament continued to bypass local legislatures, juries, and militias to enact and enforce laws and taxes, colonial resentment turned to open resistance. Colonists issued statements of their rights, appealed to the King and people of Britain, and petitioned Parliament. They boycotted British goods and harassed royal officials. Some protests turned violent. Different economic interests, regional or ethnic identities, and religious beliefs divided the colonists. But as they began to communicate and coordinate insurgencies, they came to realize that they shared a common understanding of their rights and liberties. When Britain stationed troops in Boston, many colonists feared that the king intended to rule by force of arms. Scuffles between soldiers and protesters became commonplace. On March 5, 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd that had been pelting them with insults and snowballs. 5 colonists were killed. John Adams, who defended the soldiers in court, portrayed them as victims as a motley rabble of saucy boys and outlandish jack-tars. Others saw them as patriots. Popular leaders pointed to the massacre as evidence that a standing army threatened American liberty and American lives. When Parliament imposed the Tea Act in 1773, colonists believed they were being forced to buy tea only from the British East India Company. On December 16th, about 50 men, some dressed as Indians, others with blackened faces, boarded ships in Boston's harbor and tossed chests of tea overboard. Parliament retaliated by closing the port of Boston, dispatching more troops, and suspending civilian government in Massachusetts. Other colonies rallied in support, dumping tea in several ports. In Edenton, North Carolina, women resolved to drink only apple cider, sweet buttermilk, or cool spring water. This British cartoon depicts the fate of Boston Customs Officer John Malcolm, who was tarred and feathered and forced to drink tea in 1774. As early as 1645, the British Army had adopted scarlet as the color for its woolen regimental coats. A difficult and expensive color to produce, bright red was meant to convey the superiority of British troops and to strike terror into the hearts of troops clad in lesser hues. Following the French and Indian War, Britain stationed about 1/5 of its entire army in the colonies. British troops were stationed in port cities and assigned to frontier outposts from Florida to Nova Scotia. Many colonists viewed these paid professionals with awe and pride. Many others distrusted the red-coated soldiers, derisively calling them lobsterbacks, and feared that they would carry out the king's bidding even against the opposition of the colonists. The troops of George III have crossed the wide Atlantic not to engage an enemy, complained John Hancock, but to trample on the rights and liberties of his most loyal subjects. This uniform was recreated in 2020 from the type worn by enlisted men of the 29th Regiment of Foot, the British company that fired on colonists at the Boston Massacre in 1770. Since no uniforms from the 29th survive, a historical tailor made this one based on details that appear in Henry Pelham's engraving of the event. Shortly after Andrew Oliver was appointed distributor of stamps for Massachusetts in 1765, an angry mob hoping to force his resignation hanged his effigy from the branch of an elm tree in Boston. The figure of a devil in a boot hanging from another branch represented Lord Bute, the king's influential advisor who advocated taxing the colonies. Crowds in other colonies sought to intimidate tax agents by hanging their effigies from similar liberty trees or sturdy liberty poles, and went on to tar and feather agents who would not resign. Alright guys, that brings us to the end of the first part of this exhibit covering the French and Indian War, an often overlooked but incredibly important chapter in early American history. While the British emerged victorious against the French and gained a huge amount of territory in North America, that victory came with a heavy financial cost. Britain's war debt led to new taxes and tighter control over the American colonies, which sparked resentment among colonists who had just fought alongside the British troops and generally considered them allies. This war did not just redraw the map, it reshaped the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. The seeds of revolution were planted here in the tensions that followed. So while independence was still a few years away, the path to 1776 really started with the aftermath of this very conflict. Thank you so much for watching and experiencing the first part of the Americans at War series. In tomorrow's video, we are going to dive into the Revolutionary War, the fight for independence, and the birth of a new nation. Hope to see you back again for that adventure. Bye, everybody.